My name is Melissa Carter, and I'm 29 years old. This happened in late October last year during a camping trip I should have said no to. Looking back now, I wish I'd trusted my instincts. But when your boyfriend insists and his plans include his best friend and an RV, you shrug and say, sure, why not? What could possibly go wrong? We were heading to the Gladetoop Trail in Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri. It was one of those scenic, out-of-the-way places Travis found online while scouring for hidden gems. He was always chasing after some unspoiled piece of wilderness he could claim he'd conquered. He thought this trip would be perfect, a 4-day getaway with me, his best friend Eli, and Eli's sister Hannah. I liked camping, but not like this. Not with Travis's demanding itineraries where relaxing meant hiking until your legs felt like jelly and eating instant noodles by firelight. Eli was just as much of a wild card. He was funny, sure, but in that irresponsible, forget-everything important kind of way. And Hannah? Sweet girl, but quiet. She mostly stayed behind her camera, snapping pictures of sunsets and deer. The first day went smoothly enough. We parked the RV in a clearing off the trail, surrounded by trees turning gold and orange in the autumn chill. Travis was in his element, barking orders and setting up camp. Eli fumbled through his backpack, realizing he'd forgotten fuel for the portable stove. Guess it's campfire cooking then? He joked, earning a glare from Travis. Relax, man, it's just food. Hannah wandered off to take photos while Travis grumbled about having to adjust the meal plan. I tried to smooth things over, but I could feel the tension already brewing. That night, the forest came alive with strange sounds. The crackle of our fire barely masked the occasional rustling in the bushes or the distant hoots of owls. At one point, we heard whistling, high and sharp, like someone calling for a dog. We all froze. Probably the wind, Travis said, poking the fire. Eli smirked. Or a ghost. Isn't this place supposed to be haunted? Stop it, I snapped, but even I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine. The second day started with an ambitious hike. Travis insisted we take a trail that wasn't marked on the map, claiming it would lead to a hidden overlook. The trail was narrow and rocky, winding through dense trees that seemed to close in on us the further we went. Hannah stopped often to take pictures, capturing the way the light filtered through the leaves. She lingered behind, so I stayed with her while Travis and Eli forged ahead. I didn't mind the slower pace. Something about the forest felt off. The trees were too still, the silence too heavy. No birds chirped, no squirrels darted across the path. Just the crunch of our boots and the occasional click of Hannah's camera. By the time we caught up with the others, they were standing at the edge of a clearing, staring at something. A deer stood frozen in the middle of the trail, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It didn't move, even when we got closer. That's weird, Hannah murmured, snapping a photo. We should keep going, Travis said, his voice tight. The deer watched us as we passed, its dark eyes following our every step. That night, the unease deepened. While sitting around the campfire, a stranger appeared on the trail. He was an older man, wearing a tattered coat and carrying a walking stick. He stopped just at the edge of the firelight, his face shadowed. Evening, he said, his voice raspy. You folks camping out here? Travis nodded. Yeah, why? The man smiled faintly. Just be careful. Some places in these woods don't take kindly to visitors. Before any of us could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. Eli laughed nervously. Well, that wasn't creepy at all. Travis brushed it off, but Hannah and I exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the man's words lingered in my mind. The third night was the worst. It started with voices, soft and indistinct, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I woke up in the RV, thinking it was one of the guys, but when I looked out the window, I saw a figure standing by the dying campfire. "Travis?" I whispered, but he was asleep beside me. The figure turned its head toward the RV, and in the dim light I thought I saw Eli's face, but something was wrong. The way he moved, jerky and unnatural, made my skin crawl. I shook Travis awake. "There's someone out there." He groaned and got up, peering out the window. By then, the figure was gone. "You're imagining things," he said, climbing back into bed. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, Hannah showed us the photos she'd taken. One of them made my blood run cold. It was a shot of the clearing, but in the background, just beyond the trees, was a tall, distorted figure. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. "Did you see this when you took it?" I asked, my voice shaking. Hannah shook her head. "No, I swear it wasn't there." Travis dismissed it as a trick of the light, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Eli, of course, made a joke about Bigfoot, but even he seemed unsettled. By the time night fell, we were all on edge. The forest felt alive, pressing in on us with an almost tangible weight. The whispers returned, louder this time, and they weren't just random sounds. They were calling our names. "Melissa," a voice hissed, soft and familiar. I froze, gripping the edge of my seat. "Did you hear that?" Eli nodded, his face pale. "It said my name too." Travis grabbed the hatchet we'd been using to chop firewood. "Stay here," he ordered, stepping outside. "Don't," I begged, but he didn't listen. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then we heard it, a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. Travis didn't come back. We locked the RV and huddled together, waiting for dawn. The thing outside clawed at the windows, whispering in Travis's voice, begging us to let it in. It wasn't until the first light of morning that the noises stopped. Hannah and I wanted to leave immediately, but the RV wouldn't start. Eli went outside to check the engine and didn't come back. When we finally worked up the courage to look for him, all we found was his jacket, shredded and stained with blood. Hannah and I fled on foot, following the trail back to the main road. We didn't stop until we reached a ranger station hours later. When we tried to explain what had happened, the ranger just shook his head. "People go missing out there all the time," he said. "Best to stay away." As we drove home, I spotted a figure standing by the roadside. It looked like Eli, but his face was blank, expressionless. He raised a hand in a slow wave as we passed. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't think I ever will. Some places aren't meant for people. Some places belong to something else entirely. My name is Rebecca Lawson, but everyone calls me Becca. I'm 34 years old, and last fall, I made the worst mistake of my life. I thought I was just going on another camping trip. I thought I needed peace, time to think, and space to heal after my divorce. But what I found in the Hercules Glades wilderness wasn't peace. It was something else entirely. Something I still can't explain. This happened in October. The air was crisp, the leaves were fiery shades of red and orange, and the world felt quiet, as though it were holding its breath. I packed up my RV, a trusty old Ford I'd refurbished myself, and headed to a remote spot deep in the forest. I'd heard about the area from some travel blog. It mentioned breathtaking glades and a challenging hike to a place called Devil's Hollow. Perfect for someone who wanted to be alone. Or so I thought. The drive was beautiful, but isolating. The further I got from civilization, the narrower the roads became. I didn't pass another car for miles. When I finally reached the ranger station at the edge of the wilderness, I was greeted by an older woman with sharp, watchful eyes. Her name tag read Maggie. "You're going all the way out to Devil's Hollow?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I shrugged. "That's the plan. Heard it's beautiful." "It's cursed," she said flatly. "Bad things happen there." I laughed nervously, unsure if she was joking. She wasn't. Her expression didn't change. "If you must go, stay out of the glade after sundown," Maggie warned. "The forest takes what it's owed." I brushed off her words as local folklore and left, eager to set up camp before dark. I parked the RV in a clearing not far from the main trail. The spot was perfect, quiet, secluded, and surrounded by towering trees that swayed gently in the breeze. I spent the evening setting up camp, cooking over a small fire, and trying to convince myself I'd made the right decision coming out here. The first sign of trouble came as I was falling asleep. I heard it faintly at first, a soft rustling outside the RV. Probably an animal, I thought. But then came the whispering. It wasn't words exactly, just faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to circle the RV. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound stopped as soon as I turned on the lights. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself, "just your imagination." The next morning, I decided to hike to Devil's Hollow. It wasn't an official trail, which made it harder to navigate. My compass acted strangely, spinning lazily as if it couldn't find north. I chalked it up to a malfunction and kept going, using the sun to guide me. About halfway there, I ran into a man carrying a hunting rifle. He was tall and weathered, with a face that looked like it had seen more than it cared to. "You shouldn't be here," he said, blocking my path. "It's a public park," I replied, trying to sound confident. He shook his head. "Not this part. The glade isn't safe." "Why?" I asked, more annoyed than scared. His eyes narrowed. "You won't believe me if I tell you. Just don't stay out here after dark." Before I could respond, he turned and disappeared into the trees. When I finally reached Devil's Hollow, I understood why people talked about it the way they did. The place didn't feel right. It was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive, eerie silence. The glade was a wide, open space surrounded by gnarled trees. In the center was a patch of scorched earth, as though a fire had burned there long ago. I took a few pictures, but my unease grew with every passing minute. Something about the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. I noticed strange symbols carved into the trees, circles, triangles, and spirals I couldn't decipher. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, circling the RV like a predator stalking its prey. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, and far too human for comfort. I locked the doors and peered through the window, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The beam caught a shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. The figure tilted its head unnaturally, and my blood turned to ice. The next morning, I found footprints around the RV, barefoot prints, too large to be human. My supplies were disturbed, and one of my chairs was gone. I decided I couldn't stay another night. But when I tried to start the RV, the battery was dead. No lights, no engine, nothing. Panic began to set in. That afternoon, I ventured back to the glade, hoping to find cell service or someone who could help. Instead, I found more signs of the supernatural. Items scattered around the glade. A rusted pocket watch, a child's shoe, a shattered compass. None of them looked recent. And then I heard it, a voice calling my name. "Becca." It was faint, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from a person. It was coming from the trees. By nightfall, the spirits grew bolder. The RV shook violently as something clawed at the walls. The whispers turned into screams, familiar voices, voices from my past. My ex-husband's voice rang out, cruel and mocking, echoing words he'd once said to me in anger. "You're nothing without me." I covered my ears, rocking back and forth, but the voices wouldn't stop. When the door to the RV slammed open, I grabbed a piece of firewood and ran. The forest seemed to shift as I fled, paths twisting and looping back on themselves. The shadows followed me, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. I stumbled into the glade, clutching the firewood like a weapon. In the center of the scorched earth was a book, a diary, its pages filled with frantic, illegible writing. Desperate, I tore out a page and lit it with my lighter. The moment the page burned, the shadows recoiled, screaming in a deafening chorus. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing on the road just as a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. A ranger found me and took me to the station. I tried to explain, but my story sounded insane, even to me. Maggie was there, her expression unreadable. "You burned the book, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, too shaken to speak. She sighed. "It won't be the last time someone stumbles into Devil's Hollow. The forest always takes what it's owed." As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the forest was the same shadowy figure, its head tilted, watching me leave. I don't camp anymore. Some places aren't meant for people. Some places belong to something else entirely. My name is Liam Hayes, and I'm 41 years old. This happened just last October, though sometimes it feels like a dream, a fevered, impossible nightmare. But I know it wasn't. The evidence is still on my hard drive, and the memories refuse to fade. I was on a solo trip to Wilson's Creek National Battlefield near Republic, Missouri. As an amateur documentarian and history enthusiast, I'd been traveling in my RV for months, recording footage for a series about haunted Civil War sites. Wilson's Creek was next on my list, known for its brutal battle in 1861 and the ghost stories that lingered. People claimed to hear phantom cannon fire, see soldiers in the fog, and even witness the Ray House transform into the bustling field hospital it once was. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the stories intrigued me. Besides, documenting them made for good content. That's all this was supposed to be, a project. Something to keep my mind busy after my wife, Claire, passed away. I pulled into the parking lot of the Wilson's Creek Visitor Center mid-afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the fields. The park was quiet, eerily so for a place of such historical significance. I'd expected other visitors, but I seemed to have the battlefield to myself. Inside the visitor center, I met Betty, a sprightly older woman who offered to guide me through the park. Her knowledge was impressive, rattling off battle strategies and casualty numbers like they were yesterday's news. But when I asked her about the hauntings, her tone shifted. "People see things," she said cryptically. "Hear things, especially at night." "What kind of things?" I pressed, angling my phone's voice recorder closer. Betty pursed her lips. "Soldiers, mostly. Lost souls. Some say the battlefield replays itself like a broken record. I'd stay away after dark if I were you." I smiled politely but dismissed her warning. Ghosts weren't real. History was. That evening, I parked my RV in a designated camping area not far from the Ray House. The house was a stark, white structure, quiet and unassuming in the fading light. It was hard to imagine it had once been a bloody field hospital. As the sun dipped below the horizon, The park transformed. The peaceful stillness of the day gave way to something heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. I set up my equipment, tripods, cameras, audio recorders, near the Ray house. Around midnight, I reviewed the first round of footage in the RV. My heart skipped a beat when I heard faint, muffled cries on the audio track. They sounded like men shouting orders, followed by a sharp crack that could have been a musket. But when I checked the video, the field was empty. No movement. No source. The next morning, I met Ethan, a park ranger, as I hiked back towards the Ray house. He was young, but carried himself like someone who'd seen more than he let on. "You're the guy camping out here, huh?" he asked, adjusting his hat. "Yeah, working on a documentary," I replied, pointing to my camera gear. Ethan hesitated, then said, "Be careful out there. You might not believe the stories, but this place has a way of getting to people." "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Some folks see things they can't explain. A couple of tourists last year left in the middle of the night. Said they heard someone walking around their tent, but no one was there." I nodded, though I didn't take him seriously. Ghost stories were great for tourism, but I needed hard evidence. That afternoon, I ventured deeper into the battlefield. The fields stretched out endlessly, dotted with weathered cannons and plaques marking key moments in the battle. I took some stunning shots of the landscape, but my focus was on the Ray house. As I approached, I noticed something strange. Bits of old fabric and rusted tools scattered near the house. They looked like bandages and surgical instruments. But how could they still be here after more than a century? I reached for my camera, but a faint groan stopped me cold. It sounded human, but when I spun around, the field was empty. That night, the battlefield came alive. I was filming the moonlit fields when I saw it, a flickering light in the distance. It looked like a campfire, but it wasn't there during the day. As I walked toward it, the air grew colder. My breath misted in front of me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Then I saw them, shadowy figures moving through the fog. At first, they were faint outlines, but as I got closer, they sharpened into the forms of soldiers. Some marched in formation, rifles in hand. Others slumped over, clutching wounds. Their faces were pale and blurred, like watercolors bleeding into paper. I froze, my camera dangling uselessly from my neck. They didn't notice me, or if they did, they didn't care. They were trapped in their own endless battle, repeating the same moments over and over. I stumbled back to the RV, but the activity didn't stop. As I fumbled with the door, a deafening blast echoed through the night. It was unmistakably cannon fire. Inside, the RV felt like a cage. The walls shook, and the lights flickered. I heard voices outside, men shouting orders, horses neighing, the clash of metal on metal. But when I peered through the window, the battlefield was empty. The sounds grew louder, unbearable. Then came the knocking. A single, deliberate knock on the RV door. I didn't answer. Another knock, then another, more insistent. Finally, I swung the door open, flashlight in hand. No one was there. But as the beam swept across the ground, I saw fresh footprints in the mud. Boot prints, leading away from the RV and disappearing into the field. I couldn't stay another night. I packed up my equipment and tried to start the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. I cursed and grabbed my phone, only to find it wouldn't turn on. Every piece of technology I had was failing. Desperate, I started walking toward the visitor center. The battlefield was pitch black, and the fog seemed thicker than before. As I stumbled through the fields, I heard it again, my name, whispered from somewhere in the fog. Liam. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the visitor center, the sun was rising. Betty was there, opening up for the day, I tried to explain what had happened, but she just smiled sadly. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she asked. I nodded, too shaken to speak. Betty leaned closer. "They're not done fighting. They never will be." I left Wilson's Creek that morning, swearing never to return. But the footage I captured tells a different story. In every frame, just behind me, is a shadowy figure. A soldier watching, waiting. Some battles never end. My name is Jack Reed, and I'm 41 years old. This happened just a few months ago in Quever River State Park, Missouri. I'd taken my RV out for a long weekend, hoping to find some peace and clarity after losing my wife, Emily, in a car accident last year. The grief was unbearable, and I thought maybe some solitude in the woods would help me reconnect with myself. I couldn't have been more wrong. The trip started normally enough. I parked my RV in a quiet, secluded spot near the river. It was late afternoon, and the golden sunlight filtered through the trees, making the forest look almost magical. I didn't see any other campers around, but that suited me just fine. I wasn't in the mood for small talk or friendly neighbors. This trip was about healing, or at least trying to. After setting up camp, I took a short hike to stretch my legs and get familiar with the area. The trails were beautiful, winding through dense woods that smelled of pine and damp earth. About a mile in, I stumbled across an old swing set tucked into a clearing. It was rusted and overgrown with weeds, like something out of a forgotten childhood. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't say why. I turned back before the sun started to set, eager to get back to the safety of my RV. That night, I built a small fire and cooked dinner. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves. I tried to focus on the crackle of the fire, but something felt off. The air was too still, like the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, I crawled into bed. That's when I heard it, laughter. Soft, high-pitched giggles, faint but distinct. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, drifting through the trees. "Kids?" I muttered to myself. It didn't make sense. There were no families around, at least not that I'd seen. The laughter continued for a few minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me and forced myself to sleep. The next day, I decided to hike one of the longer trails. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn morning that usually lifted my spirits. But the woods felt different now, as if they were watching me. About 2 miles in, I stumbled across the swing set again. I hadn't realized I'd looped back to the clearing. This time, one of the swings was moving, creaking softly as it swayed back and forth. There was no wind. I froze, my heart pounding. For a moment, I considered walking up to the swings to see if someone was there, but an overwhelming sense of dread stopped me. Instead, I turned and hurried back to the trail. That afternoon, I met a park ranger named Chloe Hart. She was checking the area for any maintenance issues and stopped by my campsite to say hello. "You here alone?" she asked, glancing at my RV. "Yeah," I said. Needed a little time to myself. She nodded, but seemed uneasy. "This part of the park doesn't get many visitors anymore." "Why's that?" She hesitated, then said, "People say it's haunted. Mostly just stories about kids who drowned in the river years ago. But you know, stories have a way of sticking." I forced a laugh. "You're not trying to scare me off, are you?" "No," she said quickly, her expression serious. "Just be careful. If you hear anything strange, don't go looking for it." That night, the laughter returned. It started faint, almost playful, but grew louder and more insistent. This time, it didn't stop. I sat by the fire gripping my flashlight as the sound echoed through the trees. Then I heard a voice, soft and childlike. "Jack, come play with us." I stood, my blood running cold. "Who's there?" No answer. I scanned the woods with my flashlight, but the beam only illuminated empty branches. The laughter erupted again, this time from behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. When I finally retreated to the RV, I found handprints on the windows. Small, childlike prints, pressed against the glass. The next morning, I debated leaving, but something kept me there. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the feeling that running away wouldn't help me escape the weight in my chest. I spent the day trying to distract myself with chores, but the unease lingered. When I stepped outside to get some fresh air, I found a small wooden spinning top on the step of my RV. I hadn't seen it before, and I definitely hadn't put it there. That evening, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the swing set clearing, determined to find answers. The swings were moving again, creaking softly in the still air. As I stepped closer, I saw footprints in the dirt. Small, bare footprints leading toward the river. The laughter returned louder than ever, but now it sounded wrong. Distorted, like a tape being played too fast and too slow at the same time. Then I saw them. Shadowy figures of children, barely more than outlines, standing by the water's edge. They turned to look at me, their faces pale and featureless. One of them giggled, holding up the spinning top. "Come play with us," the child said, its voice hollow and echoing. I stumbled back, tripping over a root. The figures advanced, their laughter turning to screams. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the sound of their footsteps close behind me. When I reached the RV, I slammed the door shut and locked it. But the laughter didn't stop. It surrounded me, coming from every direction. Desperate, I grabbed the spinning top and hurled it into the fire. The flames roared, brighter and hotter than before, and the laughter turned to agonized wails. The handprints on the windows faded, and the air grew still again. The next morning, I left without looking back. As I drove away, I saw Ranger Hart standing by the side of the road. She didn't wave, just watched me with a look of quiet understanding. Even now, I hear the laughter sometimes, faint and distant, as if it's waiting for me to come back. But I won't. Not ever. My name is Erica Palmer, and I'm 29 years old. This happened in late September, during what I'd hoped would be a peaceful week of RV camping in Hahatonka State Park, Missouri. I had recently gone through a bitter divorce, and I needed space to think, breathe, and just be alone for a while. My plan was simple: park the RV, hike the trails, take some photos, and spend my evenings journaling by a campfire. Instead, I found something that still haunts me. I arrived on a crisp Friday morning, the sun spilling through the trees as I parked in a secluded spot near the ruins of Hahatonka Castle. The castle had fascinated me ever since I first heard about it. A grand mansion reduced to stone skeletons after a tragic fire in the early 1900s. People said it was haunted, but I didn't buy into ghost stories. As I stepped out of the RV, I breathed in the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, but I chalked it up to being deep in the woods. I unloaded my gear, grabbed my camera, and set off toward the ruins. The castle was more imposing than I'd imagined. Towering stone walls, arched windows, and crumbling turrets stood against the backdrop of the autumn sky. I spent the afternoon exploring, snapping photos of the overgrown ivy snaking up the walls and the jagged remains of what had once been a spiral staircase. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. It was like stepping into a freezer. I found a room with a massive stone fireplace and stood there for a moment, marveling at the craftsmanship. That's when I caught a faint whiff of sulfur, sharp and acrid, like burnt matches. I wrinkled my nose and turned to leave, but I froze when I heard it. A low whisper just behind me. "Erica!" I whipped around, heart pounding. No one was there. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was dipping below the horizon. I tried to push the eerie experience out of my mind as I set up a campfire and cooked a simple dinner. But the stillness of the forest pressed in on me, too quiet for my liking. I was just starting to relax when I heard a faint rustling behind the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the beam illuminated nothing but branches. "Probably just a raccoon," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But later, as I lay in bed, I swore I heard footsteps circling the RV. The next day, I decided to hike one of the trails leading to the Devil's Hollow, a ravine shrouded in local legend. The name alone should have been enough of a warning, but I was curious. I'd come here to clear my head, and exploring the park felt like a distraction from my own problems. As I descended into the hollow, the forest seemed to close in around me. The air grew colder, and the light took on an odd, greenish hue as it filtered through the dense canopy. I paused to take a photo of a gnarled tree, but when I lowered the camera, I saw something, or someone, standing in the distance. It looked like a man, but his posture was wrong, too stiff and upright. Before I could focus on him, he stepped behind a tree and vanished. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. That night, I tried to brush it off as my imagination. I lit another fire and sat close to it, hoping the warmth would ease the chill in my bones. But the unease I felt was impossible to shake. I stared into the flames, letting my thoughts drift when something across the fire caught my eye. A figure stood just beyond the circle of light, its silhouette faint but unmistakable. "Who's there?" I demanded, grabbing my flashlight. When I aimed the beam, the figure was gone. Then, from behind me, I heard a voice. "Erica!" It sounded like my ex-husband Scott, but that was impossible. He was hundreds of miles away. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The next morning, I decided to leave. I'd had enough. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine refused to turn over. I checked the water pump, hoping to at least fix the plumbing, but the tank was bone dry, even though I'd filled it before leaving home. Frustrated, I walked to the ranger station, which was about a mile away. The man on duty, Ranger Martin Holt, listened as I explained my situation, though I left out the strange occurrences. "You camping near the ruins?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, why?" He hesitated before answering. "Strange things happen in that part of the park, always have. My advice? Don't stick around after dark." I wanted to press him for details, but the look in his eyes stopped me. That afternoon, I decided to hike back to the castle ruins, partly out of frustration and partly out of defiance. If the place was as haunted as people said, I wanted to see it for myself. In the same room where I'd smelled sulfur before, I noticed something I hadn't seen the first time. A small leather-bound journal wedged into a crack in the stone wall. Curious, I pulled it out and opened it. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, detailing the life of the mansion's original owner, a wealthy businessman named Robert Snyder. One entry caught my attention. "I made the pact. It will bring me wealth and power, but the price is steep. The hollow will never rest." The words sent a chill down my spine. That night, the entity made itself known. The whispers started just after sundown, faint at first but growing louder. "Erica! Erica!" I bolted the RV door and grabbed the journal, flipping through it in search of answers. Another entry described a ritual involving fire and salt to ward off the entity, but it was vague, more of a warning than an instruction. Suddenly, the RV shook violently, as if something massive was pushing against it. I heard scraping noises, like claws raking across metal. My flashlight flickered and I saw it, a shadowy figure standing outside the window. Its eyes glowed red, and its face twisted into a grotesque grin. I screamed and grabbed the journal, along with a box of matches and a pouch of salt I'd brought for cooking. I stumbled outside, heart racing, and made a circle of salt around the RV. The figure watched me, swaying slightly, as if amused. "You can't have me," I whispered, clutching the journal like a shield. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. It reached the edge of the salt circle and stopped, hissing like an animal. Desperate, I opened the journal to the page with the ritual entry. I tore it out and lit it on fire, holding the burning paper high. The figure let out a blood-curdling scream and dissolved into a cloud of black smoke, which dissipated into the night. The next morning, the RV started without a problem. I packed up and left the park as fast as I could. I don't know what that thing was, demon, ghost, or some twisted remnant of Snyder's curse, but I know one thing. I'll never go back to Hahatonka. Even now, in the safety of my apartment, I sometimes catch the faint smell of sulfur in the air, and at night, when the world is quiet, I hear whispers calling my name. My name is Ryan Carter, and I'm 34 years old. This happened just a few weeks ago, and honestly, I'm still trying to make sense of it. Clara and I had planned the trip for weeks, an anniversary getaway to the Mark Twain National Forest in southern Missouri. It was supposed to be a break from work, a chance to unplug and enjoy nature. I had no idea how much we'd regret going. We left St. Louis early on a Friday morning, towing our RV behind Clara's truck. The forest was stunning, towering oaks, sycamores with golden leaves, and miles of peaceful trails. Clara, 31, is a history teacher and loves local folklore. She'd been going on and on about Native American legends, specifically about something called a skinwalker. "I read about them in this old journal," she said, as we pulled into the campsite. "They're supposedly evil witches that can take on the form of animals, or even people. Creepy, right?" "Uh-huh. Super creepy," I said, half listening as I focused on backing the RV into the spot. I wasn't into ghost stories or folklore, but Clara lived for it. The campsite was remote, no other campers in sight. The nearest ranger station was about 5 miles away. Clara loved the solitude, but something about it made me uneasy. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet where you hear every rustle, every snap of a twig. That first night, things started going wrong. The RV's power system, which had been working fine earlier, suddenly cut out. No lights, no heating. I fumbled with the battery, but it wouldn't hold a charge. I told Clara we'd fix it in the morning. We ate dinner by lantern light, and she kept talking about the legends of the area, how the Osage people once lived here, and how they'd abandoned parts of the forest after strange disappearances. After dinner, we sat outside by the fire, staring up at the stars. That's when we heard it. The faintest sound, like someone whistling a tune. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Clara nodded, leaning forward. "Yeah, maybe it's the wind." But there was no wind. The trees were still. The whistling came again, faint and distant, and then stopped. I tried to shake it off, but I felt something cold in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, we decided to hike a nearby trail. Clara was excited, snapping pictures of the foliage and pointing out wildlife. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest felt off. Around midday, we stumbled across something strange. Deep in the woods, there was a clearing with a single dead tree. Its bark was stripped, and the ground around it was littered with bones. Animal bones, I hoped. What the hell is this? I muttered. Clara crouched to examine the bones. It's probably a predator's kill site. She paused, frowning. But some of these look old, like they've been here for years. I wanted to leave, but Clara kept poking around. Look at this, she said, pointing to the tree. Carved into the bark were strange symbols, circles, triangles, and jagged lines. These could be Native American markings. Or some psycho's graffiti, I said. Let's go. That night, the whistling returned. It was closer this time, and I swear I heard my name mixed into the tune. Ryan, Clara whispered, clutching my arm. Do you hear that? Yeah. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees. The beam caught nothing but shadows. Probably just some animal, I said, trying to convince myself. We climbed into bed, but neither of us slept much. Around 3 a.m., Clara shook me awake. Ryan, there's someone out there, she hissed. I listened. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, circling the RV. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood just beyond the fire pit. It was tall, impossibly tall, with arms that hung down past its knees. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed like embers. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I tried to convince Clara to leave. The battery's dead, the forest is weird, and I just don't have a good feeling about this. But Ryan, she said, what if we're overreacting? Maybe it's just an animal, or maybe it's not, I snapped. Let's pack up. We spent the day trying to get the RV ready to leave, but everything went wrong. The engine wouldn't start. The tools I needed were missing. It was like something didn't want us to leave. That afternoon, Clara wandered off to collect firewood. She came back pale and shaking. Ryan, she whispered, I saw something. It looked like you, but it wasn't you. That night was the worst. The whistling turned into whispers. They came from all sides, pressing in on us. Ryan, Clara. It mimicked our voices perfectly. At one point, I opened the RV door thinking Clara was outside, only to find her behind me, trembling. Don't go out there, she begged. The fire kept the thing at bay for a while, but around midnight it started circling closer. I saw it again, standing just beyond the firelight. It smiled, its mouth too wide, its teeth too sharp. What do you want? I yelled. It didn't answer. It just stared, swaying slightly, like it was waiting for something. We knew we couldn't stay. Around dawn, we doused the fire and grabbed our backpacks. I rigged a makeshift torch, hoping the flame would keep the thing away. We started hiking, heading for the nearest road. The thing followed us. I'd catch glimpses of it through the trees, its long limbs, its glowing eyes. It never attacked, but it never let us out of its sight. At one point, Clara tripped and fell. I helped her up, and when I turned back, the thing was standing on the trail, blocking our path. It opened its mouth, and a horrible, guttural sound came out. A mix of a growl and a scream. I waved the torch at it, and it flinched, retreating into the shadows. We finally reached the road just as the sun was setting. A park ranger drove by and stopped when he saw us. You two okay? He asked, eyeing our disheveled appearance. Something's out there, I said. Something not human. The ranger's face darkened. You were camping in the southern sector? I nodded. He shook his head. You're lucky to be alive. That sacred ground should have been left alone. What is it? Clara asked. He didn't answer. He just told us to get in the truck. We never went back to the Mark Twain National Forest. We sold the RV and moved to an apartment in the city. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whistling. Faint, distant. But there, I don't think it's over. My name is Aaron Caldwell, and I'm 29 years old. I've been a geologist and amateur adventurer for most of my life, chasing stories in rock and dirt like some people chase storms. What happened to me last September wasn't the kind of story I was looking for. It wasn't something I could chart or explain away with science. It was something else, something I should have listened to the warnings about. This happened in the Devil's Backbone Wilderness, deep in southern Missouri. I had driven my RV out there to study the limestone formations in an area locals called Devil's Hollow. The name alone made it irresistible, remote, rugged, and supposedly cursed. People whispered about strange sounds and hikers who never came back. I figured it was just local superstition, the kind that tends to crop up around isolated places. I should have known better. I arrived mid-morning, parking my RV in the small lot at the trailhead. The sky was a perfect blue, the kind that made the world feel calm and far too normal for what lay ahead. My gear was packed meticulously: a compass, GPS, topographical maps, and all the essentials for a solo camping trip. Before I could hit the trail, an older man approached me. He wore a sheriff's badge on his chest and a stern expression on his weathered face. "You heading into Devil's Hollow?" he asked. His tone carried a mix of curiosity and concern. "I am," I said, smiling. "I'm a geologist. Heard there are some incredible limestone formations out here." He scratched his chin, clearly unimpressed. "Look, I'm not going to tell you how to do your job, but folks don't camp out there for a reason. People go missing. If you're smart, you'll stick to the trails and head back before dark." "I appreciate the warning," I said, trying not to sound dismissive, though I didn't believe a word of it. He sighed and shook his head. "Suit yourself. Just remember, some places aren't meant to be disturbed." The hike into the hollow was beautiful, a mix of towering oak and pine trees giving way to narrow valleys and steep bluffs. By late afternoon, I found a clearing near a cluster of strange limestone formations and decided to set up camp. The rocks jutted out of the ground like the spines of some ancient creature, their surfaces etched with spirals and crude symbols I didn't recognize. I couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. These formations were unlike anything I'd seen before. I spent hours photographing and sketching them, losing myself in the work as the sun dipped lower in the sky. It wasn't until dusk that I noticed the silence. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves, had vanished. The only sound was the wind, whistling softly through the rocks. And then I heard it, a low, mournful howl, distant but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding. It was probably a coyote, I told myself. Nothing unusual. But as the howling continued, growing louder and closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. By the time night fell, the howling had stopped, but the unease lingered. I built a small fire and tried to focus on reviewing my notes, but my mind kept drifting back to the sheriff's warning. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. The rocks around my campsite had shifted. The crude symbols were still there, but now they seemed to form a pattern, almost like a ring encircling my tent. I knew I hadn't seen that before. I stood up, shining my flashlight on the formations, and my breath caught in my throat. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its silhouette was inhuman, with broad shoulders that tapered into long, spindly arms. Two glowing red eyes stared at me from the darkness, unblinking. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move, but the air grew colder, and the fire flickered as if caught in a sudden gust. I grabbed my camera, desperate to document whatever it was, but when I snapped the photo, the flash revealed nothing but empty forest. The figure was gone. The next morning, I was ready to leave, but things weren't that simple. My compass spun uselessly, and my GPS refused to connect. Even the map seemed wrong. The landmarks I'd marked the day before suddenly unrecognizable. I spent hours trying to retrace my steps, but every path seemed to lead me back to the clearing. By afternoon, I was exhausted, frustrated, and starting to feel the edges of panic. Then I found the journal. It was tucked inside a hollowed-out tree, its leather cover cracked and faded. The pages were filled with shaky handwriting, detailing the experiences of another camper who'd come to Devil's Hollow years ago. "I hear it every night," one entry read. "The howling, the whispers, the shadow that watches from the trees." Another entry chilled me to my core. "The guardian won't let me leave. It knows my fears. It knows my name." That night, I built the largest fire I could manage and sat with my back to the flames, staring into the darkness. The howling returned, louder this time, and with it came the whispers. They were soft at first, like the wind, but soon they became words. "Aaron?" My heart raced as I realized the voice was coming from the forest, echoing my name over and over. "Aaron, you don't belong here." And then the figure appeared again. It stepped into the firelight this time, its massive form towering over me. Its face was a void, but its eyes burned with a red light that seemed to pierce through me. "Leave," it said, its voice deep and guttural. "Or stay and face the Hollow's curse." I tried to speak, to demand answers, but my throat was dry, my voice a whisper. "Why?" I managed to choke out. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one long, skeletal arm and pointed to the limestone formations. The next morning, I was determined to end whatever was happening. I returned to the rocks, studying the symbols with a new sense of urgency. In the journal, I'd read that the guardian was tied to the land, its power anchored by the formations. I didn't know if it was true, but I had no other options. Using a rock hammer from my pack, I began chipping away at the largest of the formations, targeting the center of the spiral. The air grew heavy, the forest darkening as if a storm was rolling in. As I struck the rock, a deafening howl filled the air, and the guardian appeared, its form flickering and shifting as it moved toward me. "You cannot break the curse," it roared, its voice shaking the ground. But I didn't stop. With one final swing, the spiral shattered, and the guardian let out a scream that seemed to tear the air apart. Its form dissolved into shadows, and the forest fell silent. I stumbled back to my RV, barely able to stand, and found the path clear. Somehow, I made it to the main road, where Sheriff Elkins was waiting. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said, his eyes searching mine. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He didn't press me for details, just gave me a grim look and said, "You're lucky to be alive. Most people don't make it out of the hollow." Back home, I developed the photos from my trip. Most were ordinary, trees, rocks, shadows. But in one image, taken the night the guardian first appeared, I saw it. A towering figure with burning red eyes, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. I don't know if the curse is broken. I don't even know if it can be. But one thing is certain, I won't be going back to Devil's Hollow. Some places are meant to be left alone. My name is Jonah Marks, and I'm 34 years old. I'm a photographer by trade, a wanderer by nature, and a skeptic by necessity. I've spent the better part of my adult life chasing shadows with my camera. Abandoned houses, forgotten trails, local legends, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened last summer. This wasn't some folklore I could brush off, or a photograph I could explain away. This happened in July on the 11 Point River, deep in the Mark Twain National Forest. I arrived at Greer Crossing Campground late in the afternoon, eager to set up my RV before sunset. The 11 Point was beautiful, lush, green, and eerily quiet. That silence was part of the reason I'd chosen the spot. It was isolated, which meant no tourists trampling through my shots. The other reason, a local legend about a ghostly figure that haunted the riverbanks, luring people to their deaths. I didn't believe it, of course. It was just another story to add to my portfolio, another forgotten legend to explore. The plan was simple. Spend a couple of nights camping, shoot some eerie landscapes, and move on. The campground was nearly empty, save for one other RV parked several spots away. I set up camp near the river, unpacked my gear, and took my camera to scout the area. The forest was dense, the river winding like a silver thread through the trees. As I walked along the bank, I came across a weathered wooden sign nailed to a tree. The words were barely legible, carved deep into the grain. "Beware the Whisperer." I chuckled under my breath. It was probably some prank or an old warning left by locals to keep kids away from the water. But as I stood there, staring at the sign, a faint chill ran down my spine. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the water, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing knee-deep in the river. When I blinked, it was gone. That night, as I sat by the fire reviewing my photos, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just the crackle of the fire and the gentle rush of the river. It started with a faint splash, like a fish jumping. I glanced toward the water but saw nothing. Then came the whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too distinct, too deliberate. My name. I heard my name. Jonah. I froze, the hair on my arms standing on end. The voice was soft, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. It sounded like Derek, my younger brother. Derek had drowned when we were kids. We'd been playing near a lake and I'd looked away for just a moment. By the time I realized he was gone, it was too late. That guilt had followed me my whole life, but I'd never heard his voice before. Not like this. Jonah. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the riverbank. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the water, the trees, the rocks. Nothing. I shook my head and turned back to the fire, telling myself it was just my imagination. But when I woke the next morning, there were wet footprints leading from the river to my RV. I spent the day exploring the area, trying to distract myself. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. But even then I couldn't shake the unease. Everywhere I went I found signs of something strange, more of those wooden warnings nailed to trees, and what looked like small shrines made of sticks and stones near the water. That afternoon I stumbled upon an old, abandoned campsite. The tent was torn, the sleeping bag covered in moss, and a rusted kettle sat half buried in the dirt. Inside the tent, I found a journal. The pages were damp and yellowed, but I could still make out some of the entries. "She comes at night," one read. "She knows your pain. Don't listen to her." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. It was just a story, I told myself, just a story. That night, the whispers came back. Jonah. I stayed in the RV, locking the door and shutting all the blinds. The sound was louder now, insistent. It moved around the RV, circling, tapping on the windows. "Jonah, come to me." It was Derek's voice again, but there was something wrong with it. Something hollow, inhuman. I clenched my fists, willing myself not to move, not to answer. And then I saw her. She was standing by the river, her silhouette lit by the pale glow of the moon. A woman, young, with long dark hair and a tattered white dress. Her face was obscured by shadow, but I could see her lips moving, whispering. She stepped into the water, beckoning me with a slow, deliberate motion. "Jonah?" I grabbed my camera, desperate to document what I was seeing, to prove to myself it was real. But when I snapped the photo, the flash illuminated only the empty riverbank. She was gone. The next morning, I wanted to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, and my phone was dead, despite being fully charged the night before. I checked the tires. No damage, no reason for the sudden failure. It was as if something didn't want me to leave. I spent the day trying to fix the RV, but my tools didn't seem to help. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and decided to take a walk to clear my head. As I neared the river, I heard her again. "Jonah, it wasn't your fault." I stopped cold. The voice was softer now, almost kind. "It wasn't your fault. You can let go." I turned and saw her standing in the water again. This time, her face was visible. Pale, sad, beautiful. Her eyes were filled with tears, and for a moment I believed her. "Come to me," she said, her voice breaking. "Let me help you." I took a step forward, the weight of my guilt pulling me like a tide. But then I remembered the journal. "She knows your pain. Don't listen to her." I stopped. Her expression darkened, her eyes narrowing. "Jonah," she said, her voice turning sharp, angry. "Come to me." I turned and ran back to the RV, her screams echoing through the forest. That night was the worst. She didn't whisper anymore. She pounded on the walls, rocked the RV, screamed my name. I barricaded myself inside, clutching the journal like a lifeline. In the early hours of the morning, the noise stopped. When I finally dared to look outside, the river was still. But near the bank, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A cairn of stones, stacked neatly, with my name carved into the top rock. I knew then that I couldn't stay. I don't remember how I got the RV started, but I drove out of there as fast as I could. When I reached the main road, I felt a fleeting sense of relief. But when I developed the photos from that night, one image stood out. The woman, standing in the river, her eyes locked on the camera. She wasn't gone. She wasn't finished with me. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear Derek's voice calling my name. My name is Alex Miller, and I'm 28 years old. I don't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of that paranormal nonsense, or at least I didn't. What happened to me and Claire last summer on Bell Mountain changed everything. It started as a romantic getaway, just the two of us, a tent and some hiking trails in the middle of Missouri wilderness. It ended with us running for our lives. This happened in July of last year during one of Claire's adventure phases. Claire, my girlfriend, is 26 and obsessed with hiking, folklore, and anything remotely spooky. I'm the opposite, a city guy who likes cold beers, reliable Wi-Fi, and not being chased by the unknown. When she suggested we spend a weekend camping near the summit of Bell Mountain, I reluctantly agreed. She said it would be fun, a way to escape the noise of everyday life. I didn't realize the noise we were escaping would be replaced by something far worse. We arrived late in the afternoon, the summer sun hanging low as we parked our RV at the trailhead. Claire was already buzzing with excitement. "This place is supposed to be haunted, you know," she said as we unpacked our gear. "Perfect," I muttered, rolling my eyes. "Exactly what I want on a weekend off. Ghost stories and mosquito bites." "Oh, come on, Alex. The legend of the Bell Mountain Witch is fascinating. Supposedly, she cursed this area centuries ago after being accused of witchcraft. They say she still haunts the mountain, marking her victims with strange symbols." Yeah, I replied, hoisting my backpack. "Let's just find the campsite." We followed the trail up the mountain, the air growing cooler as the sun dipped behind the trees. Claire walked ahead, her ponytail swinging as she chatted about the witch and her curse. I tried to focus on the trail, not the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I told myself it was just my annoyance with the hike, or maybe the eerie silence of the forest. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots on the dirt path. About a mile in, we stumbled across something odd, a small pile of rocks carefully stacked in a pyramid shape. "Look at this," Claire said, crouching beside it. "It's just a cairn," I said, "probably left by hikers." "Not like this," she said, pointing at the rocks. Each one was etched with faint, weathered symbols, circles, triangles, and other geometric shapes. "These look like runes." I shrugged. Hikers with too much time on their hands. Claire took a picture with her phone before we moved on. I didn't say it out loud, but the sight of those symbols made my stomach twist. Something about them felt wrong. We reached the clearing near sunset and set up our tent. It was a beautiful spot, with a view of the valley below and the silhouette of the mountain against the fiery sky. For a moment, I felt a little more at ease. Claire was in her element, unpacking her gear and snapping photos of the scenery. "I read there's an old homestead about half a mile from here," she said, pulling out her map. "We should check it out before it gets dark." I sighed. "Claire, can't we just relax? We've been hiking all day." "It'll be quick," she said, flashing me a smile. "I promise." Reluctantly, I followed her through the woods, using the fading light to guide us. The cabin appeared suddenly, a crumbling structure hidden among the trees. Its wooden frame was sagging, the roof caved in, and vines snaked through the broken windows. Claire's eyes lit up. "This must be it," she said, stepping inside the foundation. I hesitated at the doorway, the air inside heavy and musty. Claire crouched near a pile of rubble and picked up something small and rusted. "Look at this," she said, holding up a jagged piece of metal shaped like an eye. "It's an amulet." "It's junk," I said. "Come on, let's go." But Claire slipped the amulet into her pocket, ignoring my protests. "It's probably part of the legend," she said. "It's a piece of history." I didn't argue. I just wanted to get back to the tent. That night, as we sat by the fire, the forest came alive with sounds I couldn't explain. At first, it was soft, whispers that seemed to drift through the trees. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the woods, but there was nothing there. "You heard that, right?" I asked Claire. She nodded, her face pale. "Maybe it's an animal." "An animal that knows how to walk in circles?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. We climbed into the tent, zipping it tight and turning off the lantern. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds outside. At some point, I drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a high-pitched scream that echoed through the valley. I sat up, heart pounding, but Claire was still asleep, clutching the amulet. The next morning, things got worse. My phone was dead, and our GPS watch wouldn't work. Even the compass in my backpack spun uselessly. "Something's messing with us," I said, pacing the campsite. Claire shrugged. "It's probably just interference or a battery issue." "Claire, everything's broken? That's not normal." She waved me off and suggested we hike to the summit, but I refused. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." Claire argued, but I was firm. We packed up and started back down the trail, except the trail was gone. The path we had taken the day before was unrecognizable, replaced by dense trees and more of those strange cairns. "We're lost," I said, panic creeping into my voice. "We can't be," Claire said, frowning at the map. but the map made no sense either. It was as if the mountain had rearranged itself overnight. As we wandered, I noticed Claire was acting off. She muttered to herself, her eyes distant and her movements sluggish. I tried to snap her out of it, but she just shook her head and kept walking. By the time night fell, we were back at the clearing where we had started. Exhausted, we set up camp again. I tried to light a fire, but the wood wouldn't catch. Claire sat silently, staring at the amulet in her hand. "You need to get rid of that thing," I said. "No," she said, her voice low and flat. "It's mine." I didn't sleep that night. The whispers returned, louder this time, joined by faint laughter. The tent bulged outward, as if something was pressing against it from the outside. I held my breath, clutching a pocket knife, and waited for dawn. The next day, Claire was worse. She didn't speak, didn't eat, and didn't seem to care about finding the trail. When I tried to take the amulet from her, she shoved me so hard I fell to the ground. Her strength was unnatural, and her eyes, they weren't hers anymore. They were cold, empty, and staring through me. And then I saw her. The witch. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her figure cloaked in shadow. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, and her mouth twisted into a grin that chilled me to my core. She didn't move, but I felt her presence all around us, closing in. "Claire, we need to go," I said, grabbing her arm. She didn't respond. I dragged her to the RV, half carrying her as the witch followed. The air grew heavier with each step, and I could hear the whispers in my head now, urging me to give up. We reached the RV just as the witch reached the clearing. She raised one skeletal hand, and I felt an invisible force pulling me back. Claire, still clutching the amulet, finally seemed to snap out of her trance. "The amulet," she whispered. "She wants it." I pried it from her hand and threw it as hard as I could into the woods. The witch let out a scream that shook the ground, and then she vanished, leaving only silence. We drove away without looking back, but the witch wasn't done with us. At home, Claire became distant, sketching symbols from the cairns over and over. I found myself waking in the middle of the night, hearing whispers that weren't there. Last week, I found a small cairn in our yard, the same symbols carved into the rocks. I don't think we escaped Bell Mountain. I think the witch came with us. My name is Jack Logan, and I'm 39 years old. This happened last fall in October, when the leaves were fiery red and gold, and the air had just begun to carry that sharp, cold edge. I'd parked my RV at Echo Bluff State Park in Missouri, looking for solitude and a break from the noise of the world. I didn't expect to find the kind of silence that could swallow a man whole. The first thing that struck me about the place was its beauty. The limestone bluffs towered over the shimmering Current River, and the forest seemed to stretch forever, untouched and ancient. It was the kind of place that could make you believe in something bigger than yourself, something powerful and indifferent. I parked in a secluded campsite near the edge of the bluff, far enough from the other campers to feel like I had the place to myself. That was the way I liked it. After years in the army and too much time surrounded by chaos, I craved isolation. But even as I set up camp, something about the place felt off. Near the edge of the bluff was an old wooden swing set. The wood was weathered, the ropes frayed, and it looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Yet, as I unpacked my gear, I noticed one of the swings moving. Just a gentle sway, as if caught by the breeze, except there was no wind. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe it was nothing. The next day, I hiked to the river to fish, hoping to catch my dinner. The air was crisp, and the sound of the water rushing over the rocks was soothing. That's when I met her, Bethany Cole, the park host. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with an easy smile and a clipboard in hand. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "How's the camping going?" "Fine," I said, keeping it short. She glanced toward the bluff. "You're parked near the swing set, aren't you?" "Yeah, why?" Her smile faltered. "Some folks say it's haunted. Locals call it the widow's swing. They say she's still out there looking for her kids." I raised an eyebrow. "A ghost story, really?" Bethany shrugged. "Just thought you should know. Strange things happen around here." I wanted to laugh it off, but her words stuck with me. That night, I sat by the campfire, listening to the crackle of the flames and the occasional hoot of an owl. I should have felt at peace, but I didn't. The swing set was just barely visible in the firelight, and every so often, I thought I saw one of the swings move. Around midnight, I crawled into the RV, exhausted from the day's hike. I fell asleep quickly, but woke up a few hours later to a sound I couldn't place, like children laughing. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound was faint, drifting through the still night air. "Hello?" I called out, stepping outside. The laughter stopped. The swing set was perfectly still, but as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Small, muddy footprints leading from the swing set to my RV. They looked like a child's, but they ended abruptly at my door. The next morning, I decided to hike deeper into the park. Maybe I was imagining things. Too much isolation can mess with your head. On the trail, I met an older man, thin, wiry, with a face like weathered leather. He didn't say much, just nodded as we passed each other. "Beautiful day," I said, trying to be polite. He stopped and looked at me, his eyes sharp and unnerving. "You seen him yet?" "Seen who?" "The children. They like to play near the bluff, but be careful, they're not just playing." Before I could ask what he meant, he walked away, disappearing into the trees. That night, the laughter returned, louder this time. It was joined by the creaking sound of the swings moving. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the beam cutting through the darkness. At the edge of the bluff, I saw her. She was standing by the swing set. A woman in a tattered black dress, her long hair obscuring her face. Her body swayed slightly, as if she were caught in a slow, mournful dance. "Who's there?" I called out, but she didn't respond. I stepped closer, and she lifted her head. Her eyes were hollow, black pits, and her mouth twisted into a scream that I couldn't hear, but could feel deep in my chest. The swing beside her creaked violently, as if an invisible child were kicking it into motion. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. When I looked again, she was gone. By the fourth night, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. The laughter and creaking had become relentless, and the small footprints kept appearing around my RV, always leading toward the bluff. That night, the fog rolled in thick and heavy, muffling every sound. The laughter stopped, replaced by whispers. "Jack!" It was my name, carried on the wind. The voice was soft, almost pleading. I grabbed my knife and headed to the swing set. If this was some kind of prank, I was going to put an end to it. As I approached, the fog parted, and I saw them. 3 children, sitting on the swings, their faces pale and unnaturally still. Behind them stood the woman, her hollow eyes fixed on me. "You left them," she said, her voice like nails on glass. "You left them to die." My chest tightened. She was wrong. She didn't know me. "I didn't," I started, but the children began to move toward me, their laughter turning into shrill, echoing cries. I stumbled back, tripping over a small object. It was a locket, tarnished and old, the clasp rusted shut. The woman's gaze fell on the locket, and her expression shifted from rage to sorrow. "Help us," she whispered. I understood then. She wasn't angry, she was grieving, trapped in her pain. I opened the locket and saw a tiny photograph inside, a young woman and 3 children smiling together. I placed the locket on the swing and whispered a prayer for peace, my voice shaking. The wind picked up, carrying away the fog. The woman and the children faded into the night, their forms dissolving like smoke. The next morning, I packed up and left Echo Bluff, unable to stay another night. I left the locket at the park office, hoping it would stay with someone who understood its importance. Even now, I can still hear the laughter in my dreams. But it's softer now, more like the echoes of a memory than the cries of the damned. Some wounds never fully heal, but maybe, just maybe, they can find a little peace. My name is Emma Walker, and I'm 34 years old. This happened last fall, during what was supposed to be a peaceful RV trip in Big Spring, Missouri. I went there to escape my life, to find some quiet, and maybe start writing the memoir I'd been putting off. What I found instead still haunts me to this day. I pulled into the campground just before dusk, the sun casting golden streaks across the towering oaks. My RV, a second-hand model that had seen better days, rumbled to a stop at the edge of the spring. The water was breathtaking, crystal clear and almost otherworldly in its vibrant blue-green hue. It looked like a portal to another world. I parked in a secluded area, close enough to the spring for a view, but far from other campers. I was used to being alone. After leaving my career as a journalist, I'd spent the past year traveling from one quiet place to another, hoping to find some semblance of peace. Big Spring, with its remote beauty, seemed perfect. That first night, I sat by the campfire jotting ideas into my notebook. The woods around me were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Then, just as the stars began to appear, I heard it. A faint melody carried on the wind. It was soft at first, like a lullaby hummed by a distant voice. I paused, my pen hovering above the page. It wasn't unpleasant, but something about it made the hair on my arms stand on end. I brushed it off as my imagination and went to bed. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. While walking the trail to the spring, I bumped into Lucas Green, the park ranger. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a weathered face that spoke of decades spent in the outdoors. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "You camping alone?" "Yeah," I replied. "Just me and my RV." He frowned slightly. "Big Spring's beautiful, but it can get strange. Stick to the main trails and don't wander too far after dark." I laughed nervously. "Strange how?" He hesitated, then said, "You'll hear stories around here. Folks talk about a song. They say it's tempting. Just don't pay it any mind." His words lingered with me as I hiked back to my campsite. That evening, I met another camper, a young woman named Maggie. She was cheerful and carefree, the type of person who seemed at ease in any situation. We shared a campfire for a while, swapping stories. "Did you hear the song last night?" Maggie asked casually, poking at the fire with a stick. I froze. "You heard it too?" "Yeah, but it's probably just the wind," she said with a shrug. "Or maybe the ghost of the girl who drowned here. Local legend says she sings to people, trying to pull them into the spring." I laughed nervously, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. That night, the melody returned. It was louder this time, clearer. A woman's voice, soft and mournful, drifted through the trees. "Emma." I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering. It wasn't possible. No one knew I was here, and yet the voice was unmistakably calling my name. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was still. the forest eerily quiet. The song had stopped, but the unease lingered. As I turned to go back inside, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the damp earth, leading from the direction of the spring to my RV. They were small, like a woman's, and they stopped abruptly at my door. The next day, I hiked to a nearby cabin I'd spotted on my map. It belonged to Old Man Clyde, a local hermit who lived on the outskirts of the park. Clyde was a wiry man with sharp, piercing eyes and a voice like gravel. When I mentioned the song, his expression darkened. "Shouldn't have come here," he said bluntly. "The song ain't natural. It's her, Clara. She drowned herself in the spring a long time ago. Heartbreak will do that to a person." "What does she want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "She wants company," Clyde said. "And if she's calling your name, it means she's chosen you." That night, the song returned, louder and more insistent. The voice was beautiful, achingly sad, and it called my name over and over. "Emma, come to me." I tried to ignore it, but my body moved on its own. As if the voice had taken control, I stepped out of the RV, barefoot, the cold earth numbing my feet. The moonlight bathed the spring in an otherworldly glow, and at its edge I saw her. Clara. She was stunning and terrible all at once. Her long dark hair flowed like ink, and her pale skin glowed faintly in the moonlight. Her eyes, hollow and black, fixed on me as she sang. "Join me," she whispered, her voice echoing like 1,000 whispers. "It's peaceful here, no pain, no guilt." I took a step closer, her words wrapping around my mind like a warm blanket. But then I saw my reflection in the spring. It wasn't me. It was a younger version of myself, haunted and broken. "Emma!" The shout broke the spell. I turned to see Lucas running toward me, holding a bundle of sage and a small jar of salt. "Stay back!" he yelled. Clara's face twisted into a mask of rage. The air around her grew colder, and the ground beneath us began to tremble. Lucas tossed the salt in a circle around me, then lit the sage, chanting words I didn't recognize. Clara screamed, a high-pitched wail that pierced the night. Her form flickered, then dissolved into mist. Lucas helped me back to my RV, both of us shaken but alive. "She won't be gone for good," he said, "but you're safe, for now." I left Big Spring the next morning, my heart heavy, but my mind clearer than it had been in years. Clara's song still lingers in my memory, a haunting reminder of how close I came to losing myself. Even now, I wonder if she's still there, waiting for another lost soul to answer her call. My name is Lily Carter, and I'm 16 years old. This happened in late October, just as the leaves were turning, when my parents decided it would be a great idea to drag me on a family camping trip to Hahatonka State Park in Missouri. I didn't want to go. Who would? No signal, no Wi-Fi, no friends. Just the three of us. Me, my dad Tim, and my mom Laura. Dad, ever the history buff, couldn't stop gushing about the ruins of the old castle there. He kept calling it a hidden gem of the Ozarks, and babbling about some guy in the early 1900s who tried to build a mansion on a bluff, only for it to burn down. Mom, on the other hand, had read up on the park's legends and was annoyingly excited about ghosts and witches. I just wanted to stay home and binge shows on my phone. But no, we had to bond. We arrived late Friday evening, the park shrouded in a chilly mist. The drive had been tense, Dad complaining about how glued I was to my phone until we lost service, and me rolling my eyes so hard I thought they'd fall out. By the time we got the tent set up, after a lot of Dad swearing at the mismatched poles, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. Our lantern sputtered and died as we were unpacking. Dad groaned, realizing he'd forgotten to check the batteries. "Guess we're going old school," he muttered, lighting a few small candles Mom had packed. The dim glow of the candles made the shadows in the woods seem darker, thicker. As I sat by the fire scrolling through old photos on my phone, I could have sworn I heard faint whispering. "What's that?" I asked, looking around. "What's what?" Dad replied, stoking the fire. "The whispering," I said. "Probably the wind," he said dismissively. Mom glanced up from her camp chair. "Or maybe it's the ghosts of Hahatonka welcoming us," she teased, wiggling her fingers in mock spookiness. I rolled my eyes again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us from the woods. The next morning, we hiked to the castle ruins. The stone skeleton of the mansion sat atop a bluff, surrounded by barren trees that looked like bony hands clawing at the sky. It was eerily beautiful. I wandered off with my camera, snapping pictures of the crumbling walls and arched windows. When I reviewed the photos later, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A faint, translucent figure of a woman standing in one of the windows. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her face blurred like smoke. "Do you see this?" I showed the picture to Mom and Dad. "Just a trick of the light," Dad said, though his brow furrowed as he stared at the screen. Mom tilted her head, a little too intrigued. "Or maybe it's the witch," she said with a grin. "There's a legend about her, you know. Supposedly, she cursed the castle and its owners." "That's just a story," Dad said, waving it off. "Then, how do you explain this?" I snapped, holding up my camera. He didn't have an answer. That night, things took a turn. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a mournful cry. As we sat around the fire, I thought I heard my name, soft, drawn out, like a distant call. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" Mom asked, looking up from her book. "Someone said my name," I insisted. "You're imagining things," Dad said, but he looked uneasy. When we went to bed, I struggled to fall asleep. The wind seemed louder, the whispers closer. Around midnight, I heard a scratching sound outside the tent. "Dad," I hissed, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up." "What now?" he grumbled. "Listen." The scratching grew louder, like claws raking against fabric. Dad unzipped the tent and shone his flashlight outside. There was nothing there, but the car, parked a few feet away, had fresh scratches running down its side. Long, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. "Must have been a raccoon," he muttered, though his voice wavered. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next day, while hiking to the spring, we ran into a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a horror movie. Her hair was wild, her clothes stained with dirt, and her eyes darted around like she was expecting something to jump out of the woods. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and urgent. "What do you mean?" Mom asked. "The woman of the fire," she whispered. "She doesn't like visitors." "Okay, crazy lady," Dad said under his breath, steering us away, but her words stuck with me. That evening, I wandered back to the ruins alone, hoping to get more pictures. The sunset cast an orange glow over the stone walls, making them look like they were on fire. As I stepped through the archway, I felt a sudden chill, as if I'd walked into a freezer. Then I saw her. The woman from my photo stood at the edge of the bluff, her figure flickering like a flame. She turned slowly, her face now clear and utterly horrifying. Her eyes were hollow sockets, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. "Lily," she whispered, her voice like crackling fire. I stumbled back, tripping over a rock. When I looked up, she was gone. By the time I made it back to camp, I was shaking so hard I could barely speak. "The witch," I gasped. "I saw her." Mom and Dad didn't believe me at first. But then the firewood in our campfire ignited all at once, roaring higher than it should have, as if an unseen hand had poured gasoline on it. Then I blacked out. According to my parents, I started muttering in a language they didn't recognize, my eyes rolling back in my head. Mom freaked out, screaming for Dad to do something. He dragged me to the car, but the engine wouldn't start. That's when they noticed the symbols etched into the trees around our campsite, the same ones we'd seen at the ruins. Desperate, they flipped through an old guidebook they'd bought at the park's visitor center. In the back was a section on local folklore, including a cleansing ritual used to banish spirits. They gathered cedar branches from the forest and burned them in a circle around me, chanting the words from the guidebook. I woke up to the sound of the witch's scream, a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The fire died out, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. We didn't stay to see if the ritual worked permanently. Dad carried me to the car, and this time it started without a problem. We drove home in silence, too shaken to speak. That trip changed us. Dad stopped being so critical of me, and I started opening up to my parents more. Mom got really into folklore, reading everything she could about spirits and curses. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear whispers calling my name, and I wonder if the witch is truly gone, or if she's waiting for me to come back. My name is Sarah Collins, and I'm 29 years old. This happened during the early fall, just when the trees in the Ozarks were beginning to turn fiery shades of red and orange. I was traveling through Missouri, staying at a campground near Big Spring in the Ozark National Scenic Riverways. I'd come here to capture the beauty of the land for a photography competition. My dream was to win and finally make a name for myself as a nature photographer. I've always enjoyed the solitude of these trips. There's something about being alone in nature, away from the noise of the world, that makes everything seem clearer. But this trip reminded me that some places were never meant to be disturbed. The campground was small, almost deserted. I parked my RV at the far end, near the tree line, and spent the first day scouting trails for the best vantage points. Big Spring was beautiful. Its clear, turquoise water fed by underground streams. But something about the air around the place felt heavy, almost oppressive. At a general store in town, I asked the clerk if there were any lesser-known spots I could check out. That's when she told me about the abandoned homestead near Big Spring. "People don't go out there," she said, leaning over the counter. "It's cursed, they say. Belonged to a woman accused of witchcraft long ago." I laughed. "Cursed? You're joking, right?" She shook her head. "The locals call it the Forgotten Homestead. You can hear her whispers if you get too close." I brushed it off as local superstition, but I couldn't help being intrigued. A mysterious old homestead, overgrown and hidden in the woods. It was perfect for the moody, atmospheric shots I needed for my portfolio. The next morning, I set out for the homestead. The trail leading there was faint, overgrown with vines and brambles, but I'd managed to find an old map online that showed its approximate location. My GPS was useless. Every time I tried to mark my position, the screen froze or the app crashed. About an hour into the hike, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, carried on the wind like the sound of distant voices. I stopped and turned, scanning the forest, but I was alone. The whispers grew louder as I walked, though I couldn't make out the words. By the time I reached the clearing, the air had grown cold, and the forest around me had gone eerily silent. The homestead lay in ruins, a crumbling stone foundation covered in moss and vines, with an ancient well at its center. I stepped into the clearing, my boots crunching on dry leaves. The well drew my attention immediately. Its stone sides were etched with strange symbols, circles, jagged lines, and figures that looked like crude faces. I pulled out my camera and began snapping photos, or at least I tried to. Every time I raised the lens, the camera glitched. The images came out warped, with streaks of static and light. Frustrated, I set the camera aside and began exploring the ruins. Inside what was once the homestead's main structure, I found fragments of old furniture and an object that made my skin crawl. A small doll, its face crudely stitched with black thread. Its button eyes stared back at me, unblinking. That night, I couldn't shake the unease I felt from the homestead. Back at the RV, I locked the doors and tried to distract myself by reviewing my photos from earlier in the day. To my surprise, most of them were clear, except for the shots of the homestead. In every one of those, a faint shadow stood near the well, a figure with long, tangled hair. A scratching noise pulled me out of my thoughts. It was faint at first, like tree branches brushing against the side of the RV, but it grew louder, more deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The beam of light swept across the clearing, revealing claw marks etched into the RV's side, 4 deep grooves, too large to belong to any known animal. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak, every rustle outside made my heart race. By dawn, I'd convinced myself it was just a bear or a coyote, though deep down I knew that wasn't true. Determined to finish what I started, I returned to the homestead the next day. The whispers greeted me as soon as I stepped onto the trail, louder than before. They were clearer now, a chorus of voices repeating a single word, "Leave." When I reached the clearing, she was there. The witch stood by the well, her form translucent but unmistakably human. Her hair hung in matted clumps, and her eyes glowed a sickly yellow. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt her gaze bore into me. I stumbled back, but before I could run, something else emerged from the shadows. A massive, wolf-like creature with a skeletal frame and glowing eyes. It was her familiar, I realized, the creature she'd cursed to guard this place. I ran. The familiar gave chase, its footsteps pounding behind me. I could hear its growls, low and guttural, growing closer with each step. The trail blurred as tears filled my eyes, and I tripped, falling hard onto the ground. When I turned, the creature was gone. But the air felt heavier, charged with the witch's presence. That night, I pieced together what I could about the homestead. The witch had been accused of poisoning the land and cursing the villagers who wronged her. They'd burned her alive at the stake, but her spirit lingered, tied to the well and the land around it. I realized the doll I'd found might be the key to breaking the curse. I grabbed it, along with a lighter and some matches, and headed back to the homestead. The clearing was darker than before, the trees seeming to close in around me. The witch appeared again, her familiar circling me like a predator stalking its prey. With trembling hands, I lit the doll on fire and dropped it into the well. The flames roared to life, brighter and hotter than seemed possible, and the witch let out a piercing scream. The forest grew still. The whispers faded, and the air felt lighter. I didn't wait to see what might happen next. I ran back to the RV and drove until I reached the nearest town. When I reviewed my photos later, one shot caught my eye. A clear image of the clearing, with the well in the center. Standing at its edge was the witch, her eyes fixed on the camera, as if she knew I'd be looking. Some places are meant to be left undisturbed. Some stories are better left untold. My name is Jack Mercer, and I'm 34 years old. This happened just a few months ago during the tail end of summer at Cuivre River State Park in Missouri. I make my living as a travel writer, specializing in out-of-the-way places most people overlook. I've camped in deserts, forests, and mountains, slept through blizzards and heat waves, and I've never thought of myself as someone easily rattled. But that trip to Cuivre River changed me. I can't even look at a forest now without thinking of what I saw. I was there to write a piece about underrated camping spots. My editor thought it would be a refreshing change of pace from the glitzy, overcrowded locations I usually covered. I agreed, thinking it might even be therapeutic. An escape from the constant reminders of my divorce, the cold silence of my empty apartment, and the gnawing feeling that my life had gone off the rails. I parked my RV in a secluded area near the Whispering Pines Trail, far from the other campers. The quiet felt inviting at first, but as I unpacked my gear, something about the air shifted. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd expect in the wilderness. It was deeper, heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. Ralph, the campground manager, had mentioned the Whispering Pines Trail in passing. "It's beautiful up there," he said, "but I wouldn't recommend camping too close. Folks say it's not right." I laughed it off, thinking he was trying to spook me. But as night fell, his words lingered. The pine trees loomed around me like towering shadows, their needle-clad branches swaying gently in the breeze. I was sitting by a small campfire, editing some notes on my laptop when I first heard it. Laughter. It was faint, high-pitched, and unmistakably the laughter of children. I froze. The nearest campers were at least half a mile away, and I hadn't seen any kids when I arrived. I turned off my laptop and listened. The laughter came again, this time closer. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside the RV, my heart pounding. The laughter stopped, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves. I shone the light across the forest, but there was nothing. Just the swaying trees and the faint outline of the trail disappearing into the woods. Then I saw them. Small footprints in the dirt, heading toward the Whispering Pines Trail. The next morning, I convinced myself the laughter had been the wind. I'd heard stories of how the mind could play tricks when you're alone in the wilderness. Still, as I followed the Whispering Pines Trail to gather material for my article, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. The trail twisted through dense woods, the canopy so thick that sunlight barely filtered through. About an hour in, I noticed carvings on the trees. Simple at first, like the kind kids might make, but they grew more elaborate the further I walked. There were strange symbols. Circles with intersecting lines, crude stick figures, and spirals that seemed to twist endlessly. Some of the carvings looked fresh, the bark still raw and bleeding sap. I snapped a few photos, but when I reviewed them, the images were distorted, filled with static and streaks of light. I frowned, blaming my old camera, but deep down, I felt a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. By midday, I'd stumbled upon something strange. A rusted swing set, hidden deep in the woods, its chains creaking softly in the breeze. The sight stopped me in my tracks. There was no reason for it to be there. No picnic areas, no signs of a campsite. Just this decaying remnant of someone's forgotten past. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching on the dry needles that blanketed the ground. Near the swing set, half buried in the dirt, was a small shoe. It was faded and cracked, the kind of thing that might belong to a child from decades ago. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. A chill ran down my spine. The shoe was still warm. That evening, the forest seemed even darker than before. I kept my flashlight close and locked the RV's doors before settling in for the night. I tried to write, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the swing set and the shoe. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of tapping, soft and rhythmic, like small hands drumming on the RV windows. My heart leapt into my throat. "Who's there?" I called out, grabbing my flashlight. The tapping stopped. I hesitated for what felt like an eternity before stepping outside. The forest was eerily quiet again, the air thick with an almost tangible weight. Then I saw it. A dusty, old doll lying on the ground, its button eyes staring blankly up at me. I looked around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but the forest was empty, or so I thought. When I turned back toward the RV, I saw them, figures standing just at the edge of the light. They were small, no taller than children, their faces pale and indistinct, like smudged photographs. The figures didn't move, but I could feel their eyes on me. Panic surged through me, and I bolted back inside the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. Shadows darted past the windows, and faint whispers filled the air. They sounded like children's voices, overlapping in a chaotic chorus, but I couldn't make out the words. The next day, desperate for answers, I drove to the nearest town and visited the local library. An old woman at the desk seemed hesitant when I asked about the Whispering Pines Trail, but eventually she brought out a box of yellowed newspapers. The articles painted a grim picture. In the 1930s, a group of children from a nearby orphanage had gone missing during a summer camping trip. Their bodies were never found, and the case remained unsolved. The area had been abandoned soon after, left to rot under the weight of tragedy. One photo caught my eye, a grainy image of the children, lined up in front of the swing set I'd found in the woods. Determined to get to the bottom of things, I returned to the forest and retraced my steps. This time, I ventured deeper, following a faint trail that seemed to appear and disappear at random. Eventually, I came across an old, dilapidated cabin, its walls covered in the same strange symbols I'd seen carved into the trees. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The floor was littered with toys, dolls, wooden blocks, and marbles, all caked in dust. On the walls, crude carvings depicted stick figures surrounded by flames. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I heard laughter again, faint and echoing. That night, a storm rolled in, trapping me in the RV. Lightning illuminated the forest in brief, blinding flashes, and thunder rattled the windows. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, accompanied by the sound of small feet running circles around the RV. Then the children appeared inside. They didn't open the door or crawl through a window. They were just there, pale and translucent, their eyes wide and empty. They stared at me, their mouths moving soundlessly. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. My flashlight died, plunging the RV into darkness. As the storm raged outside, my mind was flooded with images, not memories, but something else. I saw the children's last moments, the fire consuming the cabin, their screams as they tried to escape, and the counselor who failed to save them. The children weren't just haunting the forest. They were trapped in it, reliving their deaths over and over, unable to move on. Desperate, I gathered the doll and the toys I'd found, piling them outside the RV. I doused them with lighter fluid and lit a match. The flames roared to life, and the whispers turned into anguished cries. The storm ceased abruptly, leaving the forest eerily still. The children were gone. I left Quiver River State Park the next morning, my hands trembling on the wheel. I never finished the article. Some stories, I realized, aren't meant to be told, but even now, as I write this, I can feel their presence. A faint tap on the window, a whisper just out of earshot. A reminder that some tragedies can't be left behind. My name is Anna Parker, and I'm 27 years old. This happened just last summer, in the Hughes Mountain Natural Area, at a place called Devil's Honeycomb. I've always been drawn to the quiet beauty of nature. The world out there, untamed and indifferent, felt like the perfect escape from the spreadsheets and fluorescent lights of my corporate job. My boyfriend, Matt, thought I was crazy for dragging him along on these adventures. But when I proposed a weekend camping trip to a remote spot in Missouri, he reluctantly agreed. We arrived at Devil's Honeycomb just as the sun began its lazy descent behind the hills. The basalt columns stretched across the landscape like honeycomb shapes carved by some ancient god. It was eerie, beautiful, and isolated, exactly what I'd been looking for. But from the moment we parked the RV, something felt off. Matt, 29 and always skeptical, made his discomfort known immediately. Why couldn't we just stay at one of those normal campgrounds? He grumbled, tossing our gear onto the ground. This place feels like the set of a horror movie. Exactly, I teased, trying to lighten the mood. Look around, Matt, it's gorgeous. No screaming kids, no noisy neighbors, just us and nature. Us and something else, he muttered under his breath. The first sign that things weren't quite right came when we unpacked. Our tent was missing one of its poles. I could have sworn I'd packed it, but after tearing through the RV for 10 minutes, I gave up. Guess we're sleeping in here, Matt said, pointing to the RV with a wry smile. Real, authentic camping experience. After a quick dinner of trail mix and sandwiches, I convinced Matt to take a short hike before dark. The trails near the honeycomb were supposed to be incredible, and I didn't want to miss the chance to explore. As we made our way along the rocky paths, the woods seemed unnaturally quiet. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know what it's supposed to sound like. The hum of insects, the occasional rustle of leaves, maybe a bird calling out. But here, there was nothing. Do you hear that? I asked. Hear what? Exactly, I said, stopping to scan the trees. Matt rolled his eyes. Probably just the quiet before the storm. But there was no storm. Only that oppressive silence broken occasionally by a sound that made my stomach twist. A distant cry, like an animal but wrong. Too high-pitched, too mournful. Coyote, Matt said dismissively. I didn't argue, but deep down, I knew better. We turned back toward the RV as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. On the way, I noticed something in the dirt, a set of tracks leading off the trail. They were large, resembling an animal's paw, but with 5 elongated toes. Look at these, I said, crouching down to examine them. Probably a bear, Matt said, though even he didn't sound convinced. Bears don't have feet like this. Okay then, Bigfoot, can we go now? I stood, brushing the dirt from my hands. The tracks disappeared into the underbrush, and for a brief, irrational moment, I considered following them. But the chill creeping down my spine told me to keep moving. By the time we returned to the RV, the woods had grown darker than I expected. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, and every shadow seemed alive. Matt started a small fire in the portable pit we'd brought, while I settled into a camping chair with a mug of instant coffee. I told you this place is creepy, Matt said, staring into the flames. You're just jumpy because we're alone, I teased. He shot me a look. Alone? Are you sure about that? I was about to argue when we heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. Anna. It was barely louder than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Did you hear that? I asked, my heart racing. Matt nodded, his face pale. Yeah. Who the hell is out here? We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the woods. The beam of my light wavered as I tried to steady my shaking hands. "Probably some idiot messing with us," Matt said, though his voice betrayed his fear. Then we heard it again, closer this time. "Anna!" I spotted it first, a figure tall and gaunt, standing just beyond the tree line. Its limbs were impossibly long, its face hidden in shadow. "Hello?" I called out, though every instinct screamed at me to stay silent. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, it just stood there, watching. Matt grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Now." We retreated to the RV, locking the door behind us. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Matt started the engine, and we began to pull away, but a few yards down the dirt path, the headlights illuminated something lying in the road. It was a deer, or at least it looked like one. Its body was mangled, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. "Drive around it," I urged, but Matt just stared. The deer's head twitched. Then, slowly, it stood on its hind legs, its body contorting in ways no animal should move. "Jesus Christ," Matt whispered, slamming the RV into reverse. As we backed away, the figure reappeared in the rearview mirror, running toward us at an inhuman speed. Its movements were jerky, almost like a marionette, and its face was mine. "Go, go, go!" I screamed, but the dirt road was narrow, and the RV's wheels struggled to find traction. The creature's hands slammed against the back window, cracking the glass. Matt swerved wildly, sending us off the trail and into a tree. The impact left us dazed, but when I looked up, the creature was gone. I could hear it, though, its voice calling out from all directions, mimicking mine and Matt's. "It's playing with us," I whispered, gripping Matt's arm. "What the hell is it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know, but we need to move." We grabbed the flare gun from the emergency kit and stepped out into the night. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves sending my heart into overdrive. Then it appeared again, stepping into the firelight. Its face shifted and twisted, first mine, then Matt's, then something unrecognizable. Matt fired the flare gun and the creature recoiled, letting out an unearthly scream. Its body contorted wildly before retreating into the shadows. We didn't wait to see if it would return. We limped back to the RV, started the engine, and drove until the sun rose, leaving Devil's Honeycomb far behind. We never spoke of what happened that night, but the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. I've since delved into local lore, learning about the legends of skinwalkers and the warnings that surround them. And sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear my name being called in the dark.